Welcome to RHA Insights Podcast, partnered with the London Economic Development Corporation, the lead economic development agency for London, Ontario. Go to ledc.com for more information.
Welcome to the RHA Insights, brought to you by our partner, the London Economic Development Corporation. It's where we interview industry experts, founders, thought leaders in order to bring a more collaborative approach to what we're doing at RH and to hear about those individuals' areas of expertise that really add value to our growing ecosystem here in London, Ontario. Today, we're very fortunate to have a new senior advisor with the RH Accelerator, Brian Cram. Welcome, Brian.
Hello, Brian. How are you doing today?
Perfect. So we usually start with just a little background on yourself, and then we dive into more specific information related to your background. And then we'll just have an exchange of ideas, what I like to call some wisdom nuggets that we can share with our viewers. So maybe tell us a little bit about your background, Brian.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, grew up in London, Ontario. Went to school at South Secondary in South London. Then proceeded, I took a couple of years off actually after high school. Wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, and did quite a bit of traveling and skiing and that sort of thing. And then came back and went to Western and got a degree at Western. I've been fortunate, have two great kids, two daughters that are full grown and off doing their things. One that lives out in Calgary and the other one that had been living overseas with her husband and now is back in London. So it's great.
Excellent. I am also a Londoner. I will not hold it against you that you went to South as a golden ghost myself.
Oh, okay.
I also went to Western as well, so we have that in common. So tell me about maybe your professional journey. So where did things start for you after you finished your degree at Western?
Okay, it's sort of been an interesting and eclectic journey, I would say. While I was going to Western, I also was thinking of becoming a commercial pilot. So I was going to Western flying, and I needed to make money to fly. So I worked at the Keg restaurant here in town, and one thing led to another, and I ended up joining Keg restaurants first in London, but then I ended up down working with them in the Toronto area and responsible for Eastern Canada, which in their terms is Manitoba East. It was a fun time. That was in the very late 70s. It was a fun time because the Keg at that point was expanding across Canada and wasn't known very well in Eastern Canada. And it was formative as far as my approach to business and my approach to people in business, because the founder of the Keg was a gentleman by the name of George Tidball that was an entrepreneur, Harvard grad, had been in the lumber industry working for McMillan Bodell before he came up with the idea of the Keg, and was just tremendous with people. He was all about people and giving people too much rope actually to hang themselves with, but entrusted them, gave support mechanism around them to do the things they needed to do. So I was with the Keg for about 5 years, had great success with them. It was literally a 7-day-a-week situation as we were expanding in Eastern Canada, doing lots of acquisitions of other restaurant chains, building them up. But as I said, for me, it was learning from George, and it was as much the business perspective as how I worked with other people.
Okay.
From there, I worked with a company in London called Cable Share that some people may remember. And I was on, again, the building of the company in one area called the Electronic Marketing Division, which this is it, just as the internet was getting going. So it was home shopping. It was working with the major banks and institutions as they were just rolling out all their ATMs. And actually another great startup story and follow on was Phoenix that was here in London. And Kyle McDonald and I worked very closely together while I was at Cable Share. And when Cable Share started to move into a different direction, she took that side of the business on and grew it and had a very successful time with it here in the city. From cable share, moved on to Electro Home, and what they were doing, it was after their consumer business had decreased in size dramatically, and they were wanting to grow the business internally, but by looking at new business ventures using kernels of technology or their marketing channels to move the company forward. So I was lucky enough to get in the position of doing that, because it was really working within an organization, using their resources and having some great technical expertise around me as we looked at different businesses. So I was partnered up with a brilliant individual who we got the joy of looking at new business opportunities from within and outside of the organization. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, perhaps in some of as you described them as wisdom nuggets. From there, pivot completely for about 20 years into agribusiness, and where I joined Cuddy Farms. They were experiencing some challenges with growth, had some great product services known worldwide for a lot of the businesses that they were in, but were having trouble with the growth of those businesses and how to move forward with it. I was one of their experiments, if you will, bringing somebody in from an outside industry to come and help with the business. Really enjoyed that. It exposed me to, again, a totally different world than I'd been used to. I got to apply the business knowledge that I developed over the years and learned a whole lot about agribusiness in a hurry. They had tremendous technical expertise as did that. Then continued on and worked for a firm called Cold Springs Farm, that if you're from London area, probably recognize the name. Some think of it as a market store that was in the market, and that was very, very small business. The main thing that we were involved in, well, it was an integrated agribusiness, from cropping to feed milling to soybean crushing. We were the largest quota holder for turkey production in Canada, and ended up having the largest primary and further processing plants for turkey in Canada as well. We had operations down in Michigan, cropping operations, as well as some land holdings and cropping down in the Florida area. Stayed with them, led that organization until really 2007, but in about 2003, we sold to Schneider's, who then subsequently was purchased by Maple Leaf. So while I continued to run Cold Spring autonomously, but within the Maple Leaf umbrella, I also worked with them as senior VP for anything on the poultry side of the business.
Right.
Trying to coordinate the efforts of the fresh and the further process side to maximize sort of their market penetration with those businesses. I realized that I like having a much more hands-on direct impact in businesses, and made a decision to leave Maple Leaf in early 2008. And since that time have been doing a variety of things, investing in some different companies. And one in particular in 2012, I got involved with, which was called DeGero. It was an early stage company. I was an angel investor. It was out of the Waterloo area. Got involved with that as a pre-revenue business and spent about 5.5 years growing that business alongside of the founder. And since that time, stepped back from that, still a major shareholder within DeGero. I've been doing different advisory functions, typically as interim, sometimes interim CEO, but it's more advisory services and mentoring the leadership team, and sometimes the CEO directly on behalf of the board and or the investors of the organization. The one thread through that, because it seems like a twisted, is it was never planned. I've always worked with either the founder of the organization and or the major shareholder, if it was a public situation like Maple Leaf, Schneider's, or Electro Home. Not planned at all, but Learned a lot from all of those people, as well as learned how to work with people that are founders, major shareholders of these organizations, and how to add value to what they're trying to do.
Right. Well, that's a fascinating story. Like, it's quite a journey.
It is a journey, and it certainly wasn't a straight line, as most people's aren't.
Right. What I find fascinating there is your connection to either the founders or principals. You know, I think at RH, one of the things, one of our mantras or our mottos is founders for founders. You know, I really say that, you know, there's a lot of organizations out there that I would say provide a lot of book smart stuff. I find that we're a little bit more street smart, so to speak. Most of our certainly the three of us, but also anybody that we've have been joining and working with RH, you know, have a lot of kind of street smart. They've kind of gone through it. So that kind of leads me to the area of, you know, if you could go back in time and you know, if you knew something then, or you know, what along that path would you say are kind of, you know, one or two kind of key things that you learned that you really felt made a difference in the organizations that you've worked with? I'm intrigued by the one with the Zero Labs, because that's akin to what we do at RH, and I think that's the reason why we really felt that you, not just the fact that you have got great agricultural background, ag tech, but the fact that path that you took with Zero Labs is something very similar that we try to do at RH. So I think there's a lot of relevancy there. But so if you're thinking back, if there's one or two things that you think would be really important to share with others, what would that be?
Yeah, and some of it came through the School of Hard Knocks. So mistakes that were made, and luckily in most cases recovered from. Sometimes they were more difficult to recover than others. Others were learnings from the people like the George Tidballs of the world, and different people that I've worked with throughout the years. Um, because a lot of consistency in some cases, in others where you learn that that's not something you want to do, or the way that you want to act as you're dealing with business issues or business people. Um, I'd say the first, and these aren't new thoughts at all, but I'll give you some examples. I'm a big believer in, whether it's starting a business within a business or starting a business from scratch, as people are coming out of incubators, is you really have to understand what differentiates whatever it is you're trying to do, from a product perspective, a service perspective, or whatever. And the first person you have to convince of what that is yourself. And to do that, it's, you know, you've come up with this nugget of an idea that's wonderful. Now you've got to research it a bit, and not analysis paralysis by any means, but to try to figure out, is it really as different as I think? Is there a reason for my being? Is somebody going to be enticed to utilize that product or service and actually pay me for it? And hopefully, if it's structured in a way where it's going to be a subscription based model or recurring revenue for whatever reason, um, do I think I've got a good chance, once I build this all out, of retaining that customer and building on that customer base? Um, and that requires a number of things. One, you usually have to know the space pretty well, or you need to network and collaborate with people. And I'd say at that stage, probably more network to test out your ideas. Um, and once that's done and you can convince yourself, then as you wake up in the middle of the night, you can defend your decision to yourself. It's then trying to talk to some people about that and see if this nugget of an idea you've got that you think is a winner, that you can give them reason to believe not only is it a good idea, but it's a good spot to develop a business around.
Right.
So to me, that's number one. And I don't care. And again, with that journey I described, that didn't matter if it was a restaurant business, didn't matter if it was any of these other businesses. What is it that you're really good at? Where can you stake your ground? And now then, I'm moving to the next one is, what is it going to take me to stake out that ground and defend it and grow it from that point on?
Right. So is that a you know, kind of a like the beachhead type of notion where you is that kind of what you're talking about, that you know I really need to understand what I'm good at and really focus on that? Is that is that kind of along the lines of what you're?
Yeah, because especially for if it's a startup within another business or a startup on an independent startup, definitely that beachhead positioning. And because in my view, without that, and if you can't describe it, you don't know the path towards it. And I want to talk a bit about critical success factors and how to develop that path, in my view, anyways.
Right.
And the importance of it is, it's pretty hard to succeed, especially in this world where so many people are trying to do the same thing and have different tools at their, at their hands to do those sort of things.
Right. That's great. And what other you were talking about another
Yeah. So
area that?
yeah. So as you develop that though, then you've got to determine. And I'll use the term critical success factors, and it's been talked about for years. But at that stage, what's the most important thing for you to spend your time on, or you spend your money? And as I'm talking to people and founders, I'll say, okay, if you only had a day of your time, or if you're down to your last few dollars, what would that best be spent on? Because there's a lot of noise out there, and there's a lot of noise, especially as you're trying to form your business, whether it's again within another organization or independent, that you have to push aside, and you've got to say, I'm focusing on these things for a reason. So I'll use an example. At Electro Home, we started something called Jazz Systems. It was a digital effects generator. So at the time, in the broadcast industry, it would do the digital effects that now mostly can be done on Macs and a lot of computers, but this would be done through equipment in the broadcast or post-production houses. That would cost 300 to 600,000 US. You'd need highly trained engineers to run the equipment and integrate it into the operations, and you needed people that were highly trained to operate it. Well, at Electro Home, we had some interesting graphics technology they had developed with in another area of the company. We found a defense contractor who had a chip that was very expensive. It was about 12,000 per chip US.
Wow.
But for what we were trying to achieve, it allowed us to move the market in a totally different direction. So with this technical genius that I mentioned that I was hooked up with, we looked at it and said, well, if we get this chip that is very, very expensive, combine it with our technology, we think we could come up with a digital effects system that the broadcast industry could purchase for about 10% of what the cost of was of the traditional equipment. You didn't need all these engineers running the equipment. It opened up markets where at that time, the videography market was just taking off, professional videographers for weddings and different events.
Right.
They didn't have the training. It was in their price range that they could afford. And the other thing, we actually started a quarterly library of special effects. So if you didn't know how to do anything, you could get this library of special effects, plug it in, use it on whatever it was you're trying to put together. So we started down the path of working on that. So the critical success factor, first of all, was, okay, getting these bits and pieces. But now that we did, in that case, we recognized we couldn't put an MVP into the marketplace. It wouldn't work because the broadcasters were depending on this for their live broadcasts. So we had to have incredibly robust engineered product at the time. So that was job one. Now, to do that, we were fortunate because the company, Electrum, also owned broadcast entities. So we had some people that we could use for alpha testing, could tell us it's not good enough, here's where it's falling down on its face, and all of that sort of thing. So it ties into the networking aspect as well. But we didn't even, until we got a certain way along the path, we planned for how we were going to market it internationally, what the sales channels would be like. But we didn't spend a whole lot of time on that at that point because, again, it was such a disruptive piece of technology. We knew that they wouldn't adopt it until they actually could see it, kick it, feel it, and make sure it worked and lived up to broadcast standards.
Right.
So our focus had to be, and my focus running the group was, that was job one. Don't get caught up talking about this other stuff. We'll work on that when we've got time to work on it. We really have to get this part nailed. And with collaborating with different people, and we also had to collaborate with JVC out of Japan at the time for some other technology and wrapped it all together. We were able to pull this off, and it was more successful than we could have imagined and more successful than Electrohome could imagine. And unfortunately, and many of you may know the story of Electrohome, and it's public knowledge, but it doesn't matter. They ended up having to sell this division off or this business unit off to raise some capital to support some other parts of the business. But it was done because it was a little gem at that point in time. I can bring up other examples about focusing and not allowing the noise to come in from the other pieces. But once that was in place or almost in place, and we knew it by having these alpha test sites, it was full steam ahead on that other piece of it. So it wasn't completely sequential, but the other piece being, let's get the channel developed. We're now ready to show it. How do we get it out there? How do we get the disruption going in the marketplace itself? And we knew we had to do it globally, basically, because we had to take advantage of fast mover advantage on it.
Right.
It was an exciting ride. But so if I come back and look at something like a DeGero, it was the same situation. It was pre-revenue. We needed to grow quickly. Interesting enough, it was in the broadcast space, and that's one of the reasons that I initially invested in it, then became involved with it because I'd had previous experience in the broadcast side, understood that side of it pretty well. And it was the same thing. We had to focus our efforts on getting the technology right enough where the broadcasters would adopt it at an early enough stage that we could start getting some cash flow coming in. But we only had one chance when you go to a CTV or a CBC or an NHK over in Japan. If it fails once, you have a really tough time getting back in the door. Right. So it's figuring out what's most important to your organization. In other cases, if it's a business to consumer situation, the technology part may not be as important at all. It may be all about channel development. And that's where figuring out your differentiation and how to build your model around it really is so important.
Yeah, there's a couple of things in there that I heard that, again, you know, I can relate to, just around, you know, the focus and, you know, I think a lot of tech companies, you know, defining an MVP can be very difficult. And I find that a lot of the tech companies, you know, they're very focused on selling and building, and everything in between tends to, well, they don't have the time, the resources, or the knowledge to do it. So bringing in or lining yourself with people such as yourselves, and in this case, I guess I wasn't connecting the dots around DeGero's and Electrohome, but it makes a lot of sense where these founders are looking for mentors, advisors that really have very industry specific experience. And that can make a huge difference, because not only, you know, can they, you know, kind of share insights, but also you've probably got some doors that you can knock on from your previous experience that can really help those founders. And it's not endless, but, you know, it certainly helps in that process. I know with Innosoft, my company, we had a first kind of go around it with our first company. We sold that company, learned a ton there, but when we started up Innosoft, we were very specific that we were looking at universities and colleges between 10 and 15,000 students who were within a reasonable driving distance, who didn't have an enterprise system in place. Like, there were very specific criteria that we were going after, because I knew that the lower end of the market couldn't afford us. The larger enterprise customers that had a fairly large system in place, we couldn't compete with because we weren't functionally deep. But it was, and we had to be very focused. We couldn't, I'm not saying we were perfect at it, because yes, there are times when, keeping the lights on does become a little more important. But, generally speaking, I find that, in the early stages, it's a series of micro pivots. It's typically not big pivots, because you have to be kind of focused, but you're really just searching for market fit. And what I'm hearing you say is that, first of all, you got to make sure that what you think is a good idea is going to be a good idea. It's actually going to work. But then you kind of have to figure out your market fit, and don't get too distracted from that, because it's easy, to go wide and shallow, and then that can kill you, as well.
I was going to mention that about the sort of what I'll call the shiny bauble, whether it's market or whatever else. It's very easy at that point to get distracted, because to your point, there's going to be people at that point that you're talking to that have a different idea about an approach to a market that they might seem really great idea or pull you to it. I'm almost don't want to say it, but there can be sometimes government programs that people will chase that really, well, they provide some immediate cash. It can take their eye off the ball on where they really need to go from a company perspective. Not always, and there's better programs out now, but there used to be programs where you could see companies where I call it bumper bowling, going down the alley, bumper bowling, because they were sort of following the money versus really sticking to what differentiates them and some of those critical success factors. And as you said, these micro pivots are going to be important, but to me, that's not bumper bowling either.
That's not bumper bowling. I love that analogy though, because it's like, I unfortunately I hear it a lot in talking to companies, but oftentimes it's I mean, you and I both know that it's typically driven by the cash. It's a cash thing, right? And we're not going to get into that today. We will save that for another conversation at some other point when it talks about funding these organizations. Anyway, that's really good stuff. I guess I'll finish it off, because we've had a good conversation here. Your attraction to RH, or what we're doing at RH, like, what was it? Where's the fit in your mind if you talk about that? I mean, we know why there's a good fit, but what's your take on that?
Well, sort of similar to yours, I think, is that if I were to describe myself, or people describe me, it's I'm a very growth oriented person in an organization. I like fixing things and building things, and I've been described as a calm in the storm. So when everything else is breaking loose, it's kind of settling people down, refocusing them on those critical success factors, no matter where they are in their journey. It could be a more mature company that's running into problems, or it can be, somebody just coming out of an incubator. And what I've recognized as I was introduced to RHA and yourselves was you have the same sort of demeanor, number one, and the same sort of approach. It's about a mentoring the founders. It's about providing them the true support. They know somebody's standing beside them when they need something, or they've got somebody that can be a trusted partner that will ask some tough questions, but it's for the betterment of the company and what they're trying to do. And the other thing is, as that trust develops, sharing your networks with them, whether it be service providers, whether it be financing vehicles for them, whether it be people in the marketplace that they should talk to verify their assumptions, and or maybe to get their first sale. Who knows?
Mm-hmm.
I've also worked alongside, which I didn't mention, and worked on behalf of some other VCs and private equity groups going into problem areas or going into something where it's an opportunity and really needs to grow. A lot of them say what you're talking about. They don't necessarily do it. It's okay, we're going to fix your problem for you versus help you fix your own problem. And I think that's where I really see a difference with RHA. And quite frankly, why I'm really glad to be a part of it as a senior advisor with you guys.
Awesome. Well, we're excited to have you. There's no question about it. We recognize that, if RHA can continue to have some success, that we're going to need others like yourselves. And we're excited to add some additional people to the team. I think it's fantastic. Listen, thank you for your time. It was great to learn a little bit more about your background and your journey, some of your wisdom. And I'm looking forward to highlighting some of the future successes that we're going to have together. So thank you for your time. It's been fantastic.
Go to RHAccelerator.com for a full library, other podcasts, and to join us on RHA Online.